Well, last Sunday we hit the halfway mark of our series in the life of Joseph. I don't know about you, but I'm finding it again just to be such a profound story. Inspiring and encouraging and yet convicting and challenging as well. And as today we get to chapter 42, Joseph has interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, telling Pharaoh there would be 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. And Joseph courageously suggests to Pharaoh that he should appoint a wise and discerning person to oversee this process of collecting food and grain during the years of plenty, in order that there might be enough during the years of lack. And he suggests that 20% of the harvest during the years of abundance be put away in a storehouse. And Pharaoh likes this plan. He thinks it's a good plan. Not only a good plan, but a clever man who has come up with this good plan. And so Joseph is put in charge of the entire palace. Everyone in the land of Egypt was to submit to Joseph's orders, with the only exception being Pharaoh himself. And in verses 47 through 57, we read of Joseph administrating this plan in such a way that it was so successful, in the end they stopped keeping records of how much grain was being stored. And then the 7 years of abundance came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began. And verse 53 says it wasn't just famine in Egypt, it was famine in the entire world. All the other lands, the Bible says. And as people got hungry, Pharaoh directed them to Joseph. And verse 56 says, Joseph opened up all of the storehouses and he began to sell grain to the Egyptians, but not just the Egyptians. Verse 48 says he sold grain to the entire world because the famine was so widespread and severe. And so this morning we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 42. It's quite a long chapter. There are 38 verses in here, but I'm going to read it all. Is that all right? You'll stay with me? There is power in reading the scriptures, so follow along, either on your device or in your Bible or on the screen. And as we read, just ask Holy Spirit to illuminate the ideas that you personally need to reflect on. This is Genesis chapter 42. It says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed their head to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And then he remembered his dreams about them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." I'm not sure about the honest men bit, but they were right. They weren't there to spy. "No," he said to them, "you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the son of one man who lives in this land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies. And this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place until the youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as sure as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your younger brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." And Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an account for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on the donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" Verse 29, when they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "The man who is Lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We were 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan.' Then the man who is Lord over us, over the land, said to us, 'This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know you are not spies but honest men. Then I will give your brother back, and you can trade in the land.' As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, 'You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me.' Then Reuben said to his father, 'You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back.' But Jacob said, 'My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow.'" I'm not sure if you noted, but as we read through this chapter, there is quite a pivot that's starting to happen here in the lives of these brothers. The chapter is often referred to by a number of scholars as the chapter of testing. It's not Joseph's testing, though, this time. It's rather a testing for Joseph's brothers. There's a very simple message in chapter 42 for us. God draws us to choose righteousness. Or we are being drawn into sanctification, which is just that big church word of saying made more like Jesus, being more set apart like him. The other beautiful message in this chapter is when we fall, when we are lured into the temptation of sin, and when we screw up really bad, God's grace abounds for us. If you take a moment, I'm wondering if you could think of a time when perhaps you've been tested. I'm not talking about, big testing. I'm talking about just a moment when you've You've, in that split second, had to decide what to say, whether it be truth or whether you shrink back, whether you own up to something or whether you hide it. Whether there's been a situation with a very definite, clear, right or wrong response. We all come up against them regularly. I remember a few years ago at the local Coles near my house, I had gone down to buy a couple of things. It was just some very cheap things, some milk and a couple of other items. And I remember very clearly, because I only had $20 in my wallet, and I handed the $20 over to the cashier, but she thought I'd given her $50. And so, of course, she puts it through the till as $50, and instead of getting like $1 something change, she gives me $31 something change. I'm standing in that moment, the moment of truth. I have a handful of groceries that I went to buy, and I also have profited $30. Got the groceries, plus I've come ahead by $30. And I started to walk out of the store, and I almost got to the car and I thought, I can't do this. This is not right. And one day I'll have to give, this is what I'm thinking, one day, David, you are going to have to give an account for this $30. It's not actually a big deal right now, but one day you're going to have to stand and explain why you just took it when you know that wasn't right. So my conscience plagued me. And I walked back and I just said to her, look, I'm really sorry, but you've given me too much change. And this poor woman, she nearly fell in a heap. She was so apologetic. It was her very first day. She said, I'm so nervous and I've been making all of these mistakes. And I said, well, you can just pop this $30 back in the till so that at the end of your shift, you're not short. And she was so apologetic but so thankful. And it felt so good to walk out of there the second time with that which I'd paid for and having paid for it and not earned money on the side. I wish I could say that all my decisions are like that. I wish we could all say the same. Fast forward to just recently. At the beginning of the year, I bought an electric scooter. I think we have a picture of it. Jesse on it anyway. It's really fun. I won't bore you with the details. It's fun. And anyway, this one particular Saturday afternoon, Jesse and I decided that we were going to go for a ride from our house, from Ferny Grove, right through the back way out to Samford. It's about a 5K track. And there's a really great bike path that actually goes. It's very separate to the road, very safe for all those people that are wondering if it's safe. It's safe. Of course, we had helmets on. Now, one of the rules with electric scooters is you can only ride on the footpath, or if you're riding on the road, you have to be to the left of the left line marking on the road. So if the road's wide enough, you can be in that space. And the other rule, there's a couple of rules, but the other main rule is that you can only go 25 kilometers an hour. Now, this is a pretty decent scooter. It can go about 50 kilometers an hour under the right conditions. And as we were off on our little afternoon drive, all helmeted up, going the right speed, doing the right thing, we got to a point in the track where the bike path stopped and it just opened up to one of these back streets. And like there were no cars, it's all acreage property. There are no lines on the road. There's not even a center line on the road. It's just, one of those kind of outback country places where you just take care when you're driving. And I'm thinking, we're actually not allowed to be on this road. We have to be on a footpath or left of the line, of which there are no lines. So in my mind, I think, well, there's no lines, so surely it's all right for us to do this. But I'm also thinking, I actually don't think it is all right for us to do this. And Jesse, we stopped and he hopped off and he said, well, Dad, what should we do? And I said, well, I think we'll be okay. There aren't any cars. There's really good visibility. Let's just keep going. And there was good visibility, and there weren't any cars. And so we kind of opened it up a little bit, and I saw the speed climbing, 30, 35, and we were having an absolute thrill of a time. It was so much fun. And then out of nowhere, you would not even expect a police car, let alone a police motorbike, that kind of starts riding up next to us with the light flashing, thinking, you're joking me, we're on a scooter of all places in the middle of nowhere. You know, I really prefer getting the little picture in the mail. I can deal with the picture because you don't have to actually deal with a person that says, do you know that you're going more than 25 kilometers? Yes, officer, I know we are. And he says, and do you know that you're not supposed to be on this road because you're supposed to be on the footpath? And I said, yes, officer, in front of my son. Yes, officer, this is very humbling experience. Yes, I do know this. And I said, but there's no footpath here and there are no lines. And he said, yes, that means you shouldn't be here. And I actually said, okay, well, what should we do? Should we just hop off and push it back to the footpath? And he was very gracious. He said, look, I can see you're having fun. I'm not going to book you or give you a ticket. I just wanted you to make sure you knew what the rules were. I said, yes, I do know what the rules are, and I realize that I'm breaking the rules, but we will go back, and we did. You see, I knew what the rules were, but I made the choice to break them. I heard in my conscience that that was the right thing to do. And I'm wondering, have you come up against those times when there's a choice between right and wrong, and sometimes you do what's right and it feels really good, and other times you don't do what's right? There's that moment where you have to pivot, the moment of testing. What am I going to come up with here? The choice of right or the choice of wrong? What I love about chapter 42 is that we start to see men who once made poor choices are now starting to make honourable ones. We'll get to that detail in a sec. At the beginning of chapter 40, we have a world in absolute desperation. Now, I'm not sure that many of us really know what that's like unless we've experienced it personally, to be in famine. But throughout the world, there was complete famine. It was desolation. It was despair. There was no food except for in Egypt. And I'm not sure what was happening at Jacob's house, but we can pick up on something of a hint that there was some sort of family discussion going on with all the brothers gathered around. And if we read what's sort of underneath the text, this is the first time that we see a glimmer of humility in these men. Because if you track back to Genesis 34 and 35, we see on two separate occasions that Jacob has quite a lot of difficulty with his headstrong kids. None of us have headstrong kids, do we? We don't know what that's like at all. But now here in Genesis 42, Jacob gives a clear instruction, and there's no pushback. Now we can speculate that perhaps this is because maybe, I don't know, the brothers have had their ideas and they didn't know what to do. Maybe there's a whole lot of ideas that have come up, or maybe everyone's just sitting there completely speechless. But for whatever reason, Jacob jumps in and he says, right, this is what you're doing. Go down to Egypt and get food. Stop sitting around and looking at yourselves. I love the way the NIV writes that. Stop sitting around and just looking at yourselves, navel gazing. If there's food down there, go and get it. And so we begin to see that chapter 42 takes this detour from Joseph's life and now starts to focus on the brothers and how God is going to bring about change and restoration in their hearts, the hearts of these stubborn men. So they set off to Egypt. Well, 10 of them do anyway. Benjamin is kept behind for a couple of reasons. Firstly, Jacob has already lost one son that was born to his favorite wife. He certainly doesn't want to lose the other one. But secondly, and more the likely reason, is that after Joseph's reported death, Benjamin would have been the recipient of the family birthright with all the privileges that went with that. We read in verse 4 that Jacob is afraid that something might happen to Benjamin. And remember, quite a length of time has now passed between these chapters. We just turned the page, but we had a 17-year-old Joseph who was sold to the Midianites just a couple of chapters ago. And we read just last week that he's 30 years old when he enters Pharaoh's service. We've now had 7 years of harvest and we're beginning the years of famine. So we have a man who's now 37 years of age. 20 years has passed since the day he was sold, since the day those brothers went back to their father with the ornate robe all bloodied and ripped up. So undoubtedly, Jacob would have passed on the blessing to Benjamin, to his other son. There would have been no expectation for the family manager to go and source the food. So the brothers make their way to Egypt, and when they get there, unbeknownst to them, they encounter Joseph. But they didn't recognize Joseph because, as Pastor Laurie explained last week, he was 100% Egyptian. He was dressed like an Egyptian. His face and his head would have been clean shaven like an Egyptian. He had been given an Egyptian wife. He was a person of significant power. And the last thing they would have expected was that this is our brother Joseph. While they're not expecting to see, nor did they recognize Joseph, Joseph was certainly expecting to see them. The scholars agree on this. You see, why would it be? There was not just one place where you could buy grain in Egypt. There were outlets all across the country. But why would it be that the brothers came to the very one where Joseph was? Why do these foreigners end up at Joseph's table? Well, it suggested that Joseph, of course, would have known his family would be in need, and he would have known that they would be coming to Egypt. And so what's most likely happened is that Joseph has issued a rule that any foreigners arriving from other countries had to buy from certain outlets. Or alternatively, it's possible that Joseph went as far as saying, anyone who comes from Canaan comes to me. I want to see every single person who's coming from that land. He knew this moment would be coming. And we read in verse 7 that he speaks harshly to his brothers. And at first glance, it's easy for us to think, well, that's not very nice, is it? But there's actually a bit of a plan behind Joseph's interaction here. You see, by pretending to be harsh with them, by accusing them of being spies, it forces the brothers into this mode of defense. They begin justifying who they are and why they need grain because they come from a large family, 12 brothers, the son of one man who lives in Canaan, they said. And they were the words that Joseph had been longing to hear. 20 years had passed, and he needed to know about his family. But in his eyes, the cloud of dishonesty was still very much hanging over these brothers. How does he know that they're telling the truth? So he decides a few days in prison might do the trick. There's a couple of things to note in this section. Firstly, when the brothers arrive in Egypt, they bowed down to Joseph with their faces to the ground. That very first prophetic dream from 20 years ago had now come to fulfillment. So as a side note, if God has given you a prophetic dream, it might not happen this week. Sometimes you have to wait. And secondly, did you note what Joseph accused them of it's hard not to, in verse 9 and again in 12 and a third time in verse 14, Joseph accuses them of being spies. Now, if you look back at chapter 37, when we're first introduced to Joseph, it says in verse 2, in an almost kind of matter-of-fact, glossed over way, that Joseph had given a bad report to his father about the brothers. Something had happened on this particular day as a 17-year-old out in the field. I don't know what it was. We don't know. Perhaps the brothers were neglecting their duties. We're not told. But for whatever reason, Joseph goes back and he gives a bad report about them. And it's after this, in the next verse, we're told that Jacob hands out the ornate robe to his favored son. Fast forward a few verses in chapter 37, Joseph makes the trek to Dothan to check up on them a second time. Many of the commentators note that what's likely happening is that as he goes to his brothers, the brothers would have responded like any siblings would have and thought, "What are you doing here? Are you here to spy on us again? Are you going to run back to Dad and tell him again what we have or haven't done?" Now that little dialogue's not recorded for us to know for sure. But I tell you what, if you have more than one child in your family, you know how siblings work. You always hear back from someone else. Someone is always spying or telling on someone else. And so in Joseph's crafty plan, he not only gets the important information about his father and his brother's well-being, but we also see a principle that we reap what we sow. Verse 17, it says, they were all put into custody or prison for 3 days. And originally it says they're to stay there while all of them were to stay there while one goes back to get Benjamin. And we don't know, again, what causes this change in Joseph's heart, but we read that on the third day as he comes, Joseph visits them and he proposes a different plan. The revised plan is that one of the brothers would stay and the rest would go home to bring back Benjamin. And interestingly, he gives to them quite a profound disclosure in verse 18. He says, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God." Now in Egypt there are many gods to be worshipped, but Joseph is saying, "I fear God. And if you are honest men, then go back to Canaan and bring Benjamin back." There's a couple of thoughts as to why he might have changed his mind from plan A to plan B. Perhaps he thought that it was too dangerous for one man to be traveling alone. There's safety in numbers. Perhaps it was because the amount of grain that one man could take was limited. The family was large. One man's grain isn't going to be enough to feed the family. Perhaps if only one man returned home, it would be harder to hide all the money that he had planned to give back to them in their sacks. There are many reasons. It might be these, it might be others. The thing to note is that Joseph had a plan in his mind, which of course was all a part of God's greater plan for Joseph's brothers. Needless to say that since 9 of the brothers had expected to remain in prison, this new plan, Plan B, came as good news. 9 of them were permitted to return home with the grain on the understanding that they would bring their youngest brother back. While this is still good news for them, it causes them some distress as they're in the prison. They are deeply uneasy. And they begin a conversation among themselves, which they assumed that Joseph couldn't hear because Joseph had been talking to them through an interpreter. But of course, he could understand every word. And as they spoke, they reflected on their cruelty to Joseph when it was back in the pit 20 years earlier. It worried them. What they had done, that he was in distress. They didn't listen. And in verses 21 and 22, all that time later, we see an admission of guilt for their sin. They admitted what they had done and were beginning to see, is this a consequence of our own sin? They're asking themselves. But more than just that, they also reflect on the pain and the distress that they caused Joseph. More than 20 years later, it's still etched in their minds. In fact, in verses 22, Reuben says, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy?" And this is the very first time we hear, or at least anything recorded of, some sort of spiritual awareness from these men. Verse 24 says, Joseph turned away from them, began to weep. Now, this is not because he's triggered from the pain of trauma, but instead because the testing of his brothers is beginning to bear fruit. The fruit of redemption and restoration. Verse 24 says, Simeon was bound and the other 9 are released. And what we see from here is evidence of hearts that God is changing. So let's have a look at a couple of these examples. In a very compassionate and caring act, verse 25 says, Joseph gives orders that their bags be filled with grain and that the silver they bought to pay for the grain would be returned in their sacks. And in verses 27 and 28, as the brothers are on their way back to Canaan, they make their first stop for the night. And one of the brothers opens his sack to find that the money was there. The money he had used to pay was returned. And what is his response? Verse 27 says, "What is this that God has done?" There's an acknowledgement here, finally, of God in their narrative. In fact, this is the first time the men use God's name specifically. The first time they acknowledge the hand of God at work for their good in this story. And in verses 29 through 32, they get back to the family home. They're completely honest with their father this time. Remember, last time they came back a brother short. There were quite a lot of stories to cover that up, but not this time. This time they told Jacob everything that had happened in Egypt. No cover-ups, no hiding, just the truth. For Jacob, though, he's hurting. First Joseph, now Simeon. 2 sons are now lost to him, and the brothers still want to take Benjamin back as proof. So Jacob is against the idea. And in verse 37, we see something extraordinary. Reuben has this massive heart change. And what does he do? He offers his own sons to Jacob. If they go to Egypt and they don't return with both Simeon and Benjamin. Remember, this is the man who humiliated his father by sleeping with his servants, and now he's putting his own family on the line for the sake of his brother and his father. See, chapter 42 is all about Joseph's brothers, and God was working some extraordinary things here. They're being tested, but instead of moving away from God, they're moving closer to him. So what can we take from this? Well, the overarching theme, not just of this chapter, but of the entire story of Joseph, is that God always has a redemption plan for you. Always. No matter what you have done or said or thought, God's grace is enough. No matter how long you've rejected or dismissed the idea of Jesus in your life personally. His arms are always open for you. His grace is always sufficient for you. God is always wanting to write a new story for your future. Think back to stories of redemption that you know from the scriptures. There are so many. King David knew and experienced God's redemption and forgiveness when he walked away from God's moral standard. On the road to Damascus, Saul, the persecutor of Christians, experienced God's redemptive restoration, having spent his whole life persecuting, killing, and maiming Christians, burning down churches. The Apostle Peter denied Jesus 3 times. He had a temper, and then Jesus reinstates him, surrounds him by God's grace. Jacob was a cheater. Noah got drunk. Jonah ran away from God. Gideon was insecure. Miriam is a gossip. Thomas was a doubter. Samson was a womanizer. All of these people, at times in their life and more in the Bible characters, all of them went their own way, and God brought them back. All of these people experienced the redemptive power of God as He wove their stories, including their failure, into His grand narrative. Because God always has a plan of redemption. His heart is to bring restoration to our hearts that are broken. The only way failure can get the last word in our life is if we let it, if we choose for it to. We serve a God who is able to take our defeats and our missteps and still bring glory to His name. And on the cross of Calvary, Jesus offered that personal gift of forgiveness for each of us if we would receive it. That was always God's plan. And God has a plan of redemption for you. Next week in chapter 43, the brothers make another trip to Egypt and we see the most beautiful family reunion. But for today and this chapter, God is drawing people closer to Himself through really small moments of testing. And we see the brothers are responding in humility. When it comes to right and wrong, what might God be calling each of us out in? What might He be drawing you from today and pursuing you in that your relationship with Him might be stronger? And how is it that we might respond to the Spirit's challenge in that? Well, let me just give you a moment to, as we bow our heads, just allow the Spirit to speak to your heart. And it might be something small. It might be, David, next time you get to the road and there's no footpath, turn around. Lesson learned. Or it might be something more significant. This year, as you're coming up to tax time, 100% honesty is what God asks of you. It might be anything, I don't know. But what's the Spirit calling out in us this morning? Because there's no point seeing lives that are being changed in Genesis 42 without allowing the Spirit to spotlight our own heart and then respond. Respond with a willingness to be more like Christ. So let's ask the Spirit to do that now, because when we ask, He will. And then I'll pray.